Positioning web page elements appropriately is important for good layout design. So in this lesson, I give you an overview of the methods and rules for using CSS to position your page elements, give you some tips on things to look out for, and demonstrate some basic positioning techniques. I'll also introduce you to a very handy resource you can use to work right alongside me as I demonstrate various CSS techniques, as well as use it later to practice these same techniques on your own. There are some concepts you need to understand thoroughly before CSS positioning becomes second nature. The first of these concepts is the box model, which was covered earlier. The CSS box model is essentially a box that wraps around HTML elements and consists of margins, borders, padding, and then the actual content. To review this very important concept that you'll need to understand first before you can get to CSS positioning, let's visit that resource that I mentioned, w3schools.com website. They have a very nice interactive CSS box model here, a diagram as well as the code so you can manipulate the width, padding, and border to really try it yourself and see these concepts. So notice if I change the width from 300 pixels to 200 pixels and then click on the See Result button, you can see those changes right there visually. Let's change the padding from 25 to 5. I like to change the numbers, make them really small, make them really large, so you can actually see these concepts in action. And notice that this is actually changing the position of this box. Let's change the border from 25 to 5, and let's make the margin 95 pixels. See the result. And notice that's moving that position there. So that's the box model. I encourage you to visit this W3 School site and manipulate the margin, padding, and border properties so you can see for yourself how they affect the position of the box. Now there are three positioning schemes that can be used for the horizontal and vertical positioning of boxes. So now we have three more concepts you'll need to know to really understand CSS positioning. The first is normal flow, which also includes relative positioning, floats or floating, and absolute positioning, which includes fixed positioning. There's also two others that I'll mention towards the end of the tutorial here, and that is inherited positioning and static positioning. Now all these CSS positioning schemes have their own set of rules, so this can get a bit confusing. So let me sort this all out with some descriptions and demonstrations over at the W3 School site. First up is the normal flow positioning scheme. Normal flow is the default scheme, so applies to any element that does not have a positioning scheme specified for it. In normal flow, block boxes are positioned on a page one after the other and in the order they're written in the HTML code. They start in the upper left of the containing box and stack from top to bottom. The distance between each box is defined by the box margin, with top and bottom margins collapsing into one another. Inline boxes, by the way, would flow horizontally from left to right. So if we take this HTML code here, notice I have three div tags, and they're stacked one on top of each other over here on the page in the same order they're written here in the code. So if I change the order, let's drag that second div tag up to the top, refresh the page. That div tag now is there at the top. Let's take our 200 pixel wide div and move that to the top, and again the order changes. Notice also that each left outer edge touches the left edge of the containing block, in this case the left edge of the browser window itself. Notice that this middle div is displaced a little bit. That's because it has a margin setting of 15. So again, I like to make these numbers a lot larger to really play with them so you can see the effect. Let's increase that margin to 95. And notice not only does the box displace over to the right, it also pushes the box down 95 pixels from the top box, as well as pushing the third box down below 95 pixels. So you can see that margins will have an impact on the positioning scheme here, above and beyond the fact that this is normal flow. Next we get to CSS floating. When positioned with a float, a box is first laid out according to the normal flow, then it's taken out of the flow and shifted to the left or to the right as far as the containing element will allow. Floats are often used with images, but it's also useful when working with layouts. Floats allow you to go against the linear flow of elements on a page and are useful for the type of multi-column layouts popular on many websites today. Let's go back to the W3 School site and visit the float section here at this URL. And they have some good examples and we can manipulate the CSS. Let's do the first try it yourself example. Here's an example of an element, in this case an image, floated to the right. Let's float it to the left by simply setting the float to left. Click on See Result, and the image moves over to the left. Notice that in a left floated column, content flows to the right. In a right floated box, the content flows to the left. Also, here's a paragraph before the float. In the code, here is the paragraph. My float is attached to the image right there. So content before the float is not affected by the float at all. Content after the float, however, flows around the floated element. Now, if you place several floating elements after each other, they'll float next to each other if there's room. There's a good example of that further down this float page on the W3 School site. Floating elements next to each other. Let's try it. And then here we have a series of thumbnails with a float left position assigned to them, width 110, height 90 pixels. So what's interesting, and this is where the term float comes from, these are all images that are floated next to each other, and they'll sit next to each other as long as there's room. But if I compress the browser, notice that they'll now stack on top of each other as if they're kind of floating in a bowl of water, and I'm making the bowl smaller. So the balls will then, or these squares here, will float underneath each other because there's no room in the browser. So this is a very good example of where the term float comes from. You can see that this is also going to be very popular for designing pages with responsive layouts that respond to different browser sizes. Different devices have different browser sizes. So this will have a 3-column layout on a tablet and maybe a 2-column layout on a large smartphone, and it'll have a 1-column layout on a small smartphone. So you can set those responsive designs using floats, floating elements to the left or to the right. Now, as I mentioned before, elements following a floated element will wrap around it, and there are times when you don't want this wrapping to occur. For example, here I have some text here labeling the second row, and it's wrapping around that first row. So what I do is I just set the float to clear. In this case, I'm clearing both left and right floats. So I'm setting that text line class right here to a property clear both. And what that'll do is it'll clear the float so that that next text right there will not wrap around the floated element above it. Now, it's sometimes hard to get your head around this floating scheme. So what you want to do is practice by creating a dozen or so different layouts using floats so you can see how they work in the browser. Finally, we come to the absolute positioning scheme. With this scheme, a box is removed from the normal flow entirely and is assigned a specific position with respect to a containing block such as the browser window or a parent div tag. In some ways, this is the easiest scheme to learn because absolutely positioned elements won't affect how elements before it or after it in the HTML are positioned on the page. In fact, the document and other elements behave like the absolutely positioned element doesn't even exist at all. So let's go back to our W3 School site and look at some examples and demos. You can position elements using the top, bottom, left, and right properties. So if we click on the Try It Yourself button here, you can see that we have an H2 tag that's been absolutely positioned left 100 pixels and top 150 pixels. Although there are 4 positioning properties, you can position any element with just 2 of them. In fact, you probably only want to use 2. More than that kind of overburdens the browser. But to see how this works, let's change the top positioning from 150 pixels to simply 50 pixels. Click on the See Result button and notice that it moves up 100 pixels to the top. If we change that to 5 pixels, you'll notice something else that is unique with absolutely positioned elements, and that is they can overlap. Another feature of absolutely positioned elements is that they can be positioned anywhere on the page regardless of where the code appears in the HTML. So in this example here, you'll notice that my H2 tag is above the paragraph. I can set my top setting back to 95 pixels from the top to move it below the paragraph, and that position will not be affected if I then move my code below that paragraph. So it doesn't affect at all over here in the placement. So in this way, it's easier because where you put the code in the HTML doesn't really impact the position on the page at all. Next, we get to fixed positioning, which is a subcategory of absolute positioning. An element with a fixed position is set relative to the browser window. Once fixed in position, the element will never move even if the window is scrolled. So we'll go back again to our W3 Schools site. Find the fixed positioning section and try it yourself. And notice that I have some position text over here that's fixed. And if I scroll my browser, it doesn't change at all. I can still position this with top, right, left, and bottom settings. So let's set this, rather than 30 pixels from the top, 90 pixels from the top, and also 75 pixels to the right. And notice that it moves down and to the left. This right setting here probably deserves some explanation. It's 75 pixels from the right edge of the container. In this case, it's the browser window. Next, we get to relative positioning. A relative positioned element is positioned relative to its normal position, so this is actually a subcategory of the normal flow scheme. Relative positioning changes the position of the HTML element relative to where it would normally appear based on its place in the normal flow of the document. For example, if we had a header at the top of a page, we could use relative positioning to move it a bit to the right or down a couple pixels using the top or bottom and left and right properties. For some visual demonstrations and examples of relative positioning, let's go back to our W3 Schools site, find the CSS Positioning page in the CSS Tutorial section, and scroll down to the Relative Positioning section. Here we have two H2 tags that have their position set to relative. Click on the Try It Yourself button, and you can see I have two here. Also notice here they've set a negative value to the left position property, so you can set negative values for your top, left, right, or bottom. Let's remove that negative, so you can see that these are both lining up now 20 pixels from the left edge of the container. Elements that have been relatively positioned also can overlap each other, but the space will be conserved in the normal flow of the document. To see this really clearly, let's set the position to absolute. And you'll remember that absolutely positioned elements are ignored by other elements within the normal flow of the document. So to see the result here, notice that the two H2 tags now overlap each other because this absolutely positioned element is ignored by this one, and so they overlap each other. Setting that back to relative, you can see that this H2 element is respecting and saving the space for this relatively positioned element. Even if I move this over the top of this one, this space here will be preserved. Finally, we have static and inherit positioning. These two aren't used much, but I'll include them here for completeness. HTML elements are positioned static by default. This means the element is not positioned at all and occurs where it normally would in the document. Static positioned elements are not affected by the top, bottom, left, or right properties. Usually, you wouldn't specify this positioning property unless you needed to override another positioning that had been previously set. Inherit positioning simply means, as in all CSS properties, that the current element receives the same value as its parent element. So in conclusion, CSS positioning schemes define the rules of where a box element is positioned in a layout and how that positioned element affects neighboring elements. The position property sets an element to behave according to one of the three CSS positioning schemes: normal flow, float, or absolute positioning. Positioned elements can have values of absolute, relative, static, fixed, or inherit. Now, the CSS positioning stuff seems pretty straightforward at first, but as you dive down a little bit deeper, it gets a bit more abstract and is harder to predict. It's going to require a little bit extra practice. For example, what you normally would consider relative positioning is probably absolute positioning. You'll want to set up your general page layout, such as a 2-column or 3-column layout using floats. Use absolutely positioned elements that you want to move completely out of the flow of the document. And if you need to move an element a few pixels up, down, left, or right, use relative positioning. So there you have a summary of CSS positioning. Good luck with all of your CSS positioning work.